Hi, welcome to the Partement Rouge. You have found the channel here on YouTube where I like to do what I call mini readings. And the reason why I call them mini readings is because they're usually just one poem, sometimes my work, Sabne Raznik, most of the time that of others. And my reason for doing that is because I want to get this whole repertoire on here of poetry from all over the world and just generally share the poésie joie. Um, so it's not really so much about promoting my own work, although I do read my own work on here occasionally. It's more about just sharing the joy of poetry with everybody and poetry from all over the world. Now, that being said, when I read a poem, I usually read the English translations because that is what I'm most comfortable working in. I'm from the United States, and I know bits and pieces of multiple languages, but English is what I'm most fluent in personally, and it's my most comfortable realm. So when I choose a poem to read, I usually go find an English translation, just to make it easier to come out my mouth when I'm doing these readings on video. But if you find a poem that you really, really like on here, and I encourage you to go back through because there's like 100 videos now going back to 2011. Yes, we have been doing this channel for 10 years this year. If you go back through and find a poem you like, and you can read the original language, I encourage you to do so because, as everyone knows who is familiar with poetry, poetry in translation is an interesting animal, because there is wordplay that you can use in the original language that you can't use in another language, like Paul Celan, for example, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who wrote the Death Fugue about the concentration camps in Germany. That's probably his most famous poem. He relied a lot on puns in the German language, and it was very clever. But that does not necessarily translate into any other language, because if you translate his puns into another language, it's not necessarily going to make a pun in the other language, right? So poetry in translation is it's almost like you end up with two totally different poems that mirror each other. They're more like a mirror of each other than an actual translation. And so I'm very grateful for translations, though, because there's such a rich world of poetry out there that would not be able to have access to if there weren't translations, right? And nobody is going to speak every language that exists in the world. I remember looking it up one time, and there's over 1,000 languages that are currently still spoken. And so, and that's not counting like variations of the same language, like English and Pidgin English, and you know, there's all kinds of different Englishes, and then there's Mandarin Chinese, and there's always more than one version of a language. You've got British English, Canadian English. And whenever I give my count of the languages that I just gave, it didn't count the variations in languages. It was just using each language as a bold generalization of that language, right? Which was a bold move to make. And there's still over 1,000 that are still being spoken without even taking into consideration all those differences, right? So, no human being is going to be able to speak all of those and read all of those and enjoy all of those. They would be a genius if they could, of on the level of has never lived on earth before. So we really need poetry in translation so that we can enjoy this the world, the wealth of poetry from all over the world. But we have to do that realizing that the poem we're reading in translation is not the same as the original language poem. So if you can read the original language poem, go back and find it, read it in its original language. Usually you can do that with a Google search or whatever your preferred search engine is, or in wherever you live, or your personal preference is different for everybody. There's so many search engines out there, right? You can usually find it and read it in its mother tongue. And I encourage you to do that and read the two translations next to each other and enjoy the differences, the similarities, Each one will give you insight into the other in a way that you can't do with the standalone piece. So if you are able to do that, do that. Just know that I've never monetized this channel for the very reason that I wanted to be able to share the general poise joie of everyone's work from all over the world, and that's why I've never monetized this channel. That way I can share other people's work, because really it's not about self-promotion here. This channel is not about self-promotion, although I do on occasion read my own work, especially if I've just released a new book. But it's not really about self-promotion. It's about sharing the joy of poetry with everybody, and that includes everybody's poetry from all over the world. If you have a suggestion for a poem that you particularly want me to read, maybe you haven't seen it read on YouTube, or maybe you just like to hear me read it versus somebody else, leave it in the comments, and I will try to honor that, right? Today we are going to read a poem from it's the latest issue of Rattle, issue 73, or the fall 2021 issue of Rattle. Rattle is fairly well known around the world. It's one of those journals that everybody loves. And this issue, they did a tribute to Indian poets, meaning poets from the subcontinent of India. I know in America that word you have to qualify that when you say India or Indian, because of the Native Americans, right? Depending on the individual Native American you speak to, some of them prefer to be called Native Americans or natives. Some of them prefer to be called Indians or American Indians, and it's very individual what they prefer to be called, even within tribal groups. Like you can take a whole tribal group, like the Cherokee or the, my mind just went blank. Name a tribe. Nez Perce. Name a tribe, any tribe. And you will find that even within that tribe, there is not a consensus, usually, as to what they prefer, what they identify as. So it's very important, if you run into a Native American, American Indian, whatever, to take the time to listen to them and find out how they prefer to be identified individually, because you will find it's very individualistic. And I'm saying that because I have part Cherokee in me, so I'm aware of all that. But that being said, this is the subcontinent of India, and I'm going to read a poem in here by Shreya Vikram, I think is how you pronounce it. I've never heard it said, so if I got it wrong, please feel free to correct me in the comments. I am willing to learn. It is spelled Shrey, last name Vikram, Shreya Vikram, I think. And the poem is called Sestina, about the color of a missing umbrella, for Monica Gerd. It can be dangerous to accuse men of stealing your umbrellas, is what I've learned. This is an old case, but don't worry, it will appear again. The past is never as far behind as we think. It scuffles soft and heavy, and no blanket we pull over our faces will smother it. But yes, this story is so cliched we must forget it, like how our every choice assumes our presence in the future. This is a necessary mistake. A kind of person assumes the future is a logical progression of the present, and then they are dead. The umbrella could have been black or red, striped or plain, but I suspect he has forgotten this. A pity that there is no one bound to suffer these details. That is enough if he remembers how he smothered her. This is the crucial part. It is enough if he can detail the scuffle. The lie about the company supervisor, the knocking, the knife, the taking down, the scuffle in the bed, the eggs after the rape. These are the details they'd want. The future may see the same slipping, the same taking down, the same scuffle, the same smothering, but, for example, he may eat cookies afterwards, or steal spoons instead of umbrellas, wear her father's clothes instead of her brother's. What does it matter? Either way, we must suffer the thieves, the liars, the leering, the touching. We must learn to forget. This is our biggest power, To survive is to have forgotten our many deaths. To disown dishonors. Let them scuffle behind us like lost children. If you don't admit you've suffered, you've won. If you don't know where you are, call it the future. If you have lost a keychain, a spoon, your favorite umbrella, call it misplaced. Call it missing. Call it gone. Smother your anger. Call it wrong. Call it spoilt, overdramatic, apocalyptic. Smother your fears about the man on your terrace. If he is there, it is better to forget it. Your house has doors, and your umbrella is missing. You must have misplaced it. Scuffle from one room to the next, search for what isn't there. In the future, you may buy a new umbrella of the same colors. Call yourself happy. You have no reason to suffer. Yes, the law will save us when we are dead, and who can suffer to be bitter about this? There are stories that must be smothered in the making purely for logistical reasons. If we cannot assume the future, we have died already. But some nights like this one I cannot forget. So I assure myself there will be no pain in the scuffling. It'll be like a stolen thing, one moment there, the next gone. An umbrella in the making. The man said, I'll suffer anything, but please let my family forget. She offered me chocolate. I thought she'd fainted. Smother this story. Say nothing about my scuffling with the dead. This is the future. Let's call ourselves alive. Never mind the umbrella. That's the point. I should have mentioned in the very beginning of the video a trigger warning because it does talk about rape. But for me, this poem was extremely powerful because it explores that whole idea of after the rape, how do you survive what has happened to you as the person who was raped, but also as the person who did the raping, right? That was in there. So you kind of got both sides of the same coin happening in that poem, where both of these people are trying to continue life after that life-changing event. And how do you do that? And for me, there were some things said in it that some people might trigger some people might find offensive, because it was from both sides of the coin, the victim and the perpetrator, right? But I think that was very powerful and something to chew on for a while. It was definitely the standout poem of the entire issue for me this time. If I remember, hopefully I do by the time I actually post this, I'll put a trigger warning somewhere in the description box or something, since I forgot to mention that in the beginning. But I just felt like that was an important poem to add to this collection. Not all poems are going to be joyful and lovely. Some of the most important poems out there, like Paul Celan's, for instance, because I mentioned him earlier, confront the ugly and the horrible side of human nature. So does this one. And that's a necessary part of poetry. Because one could look at poetry, I have two definitions for poetry. My younger self defined poetry as fictionalized truth, which is true. It is fictionalized truth. We take truth and stretch it and make a poem out of it. Throw metaphors in there and make it almost unrecognizable sometimes, but it's still the truth, right? So there's always, even if it's, there's always going to be some little grain of truth in it, right? Some little grain. But also another definition for it is, which applies to this poem, I'm doing the mind blank thing again. I just did that in my last video that I just made today. I don't know. I'm blaming it on the current world events. Brain fog as a result of our collective experience right now, if you're viewing this in 2021, is real. Could also be middle age. I don't know. Here it is. It came back. My other definition for poetry is, it's basically the written emotional truth of mankind. That's what poetry is. And if you're going to write that emotional truth, that history of the emotional truth of mankind, you have to confront moments like this that are not pretty, that are ugly, that are ugly is not even a terrible enough word, right? You have to confront moments like this, and you have to confront what it's like to be a refugee, and you have to confront what it's like to have your heart broken by your first love, and you have to confront all those negative things too. All of them. All of them. That happens to be there in poetry too. All of it. It's all preserved. It is the emotional history of mankind. Since mankind came on the scene, we have been writing poetry, right? And that's where you will find the emotional history of mankind. Now, you can find the factual history of mankind, or as close to the facts as we can get these days, in the history books. Maybe not the ones you get at school. Those tend to be slanted, but definitely in a library and doing your own research outside of the public school system, or whatever that is, the equivalent of that in whatever country you're from. You can find the factual history of mankind elsewhere, but in poetry, that's where you have the emotional history of mankind, and that includes these ugly moments, right? But I hope you enjoyed that. I really do. And I hope you join me for the poem that I find next time, when I'm reading a new book or new issue of something. And thank you for joining me in my living room. Do take care of yourselves mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually as we move through this time together. It's extra important to take care of yourselves mentally and emotionally so that you can stay as centered as possible despite everything, and help others to do the same. Support each other, right? That's what we need to do. And I know that's more difficult to do right now because most of our interactions are virtual instead of face-to-face. But that makes it all the more important. Let's be there for each other and help each other get through this. And we will. We will. In its time, not in ours, but it will. This too shall pass, right? And like I said, thank you for joining me in the Apartment Rouge here, the living room of the Apartment Rouge. And Jonah Jago Till we meet again.